My own lived experience of domestic abuse and sexual violence, I think, changed everything about me irrevocably. When I think back to that time, I think I was just scared and anxious all of the time. I didn't know what I would be coming home to. I never knew what I was going to do wrong. I never knew what response that would prompt. It was really difficult for me to know how to keep myself safe. And being kind of consistently confronted with someone who said that they would take their own life if I left them, I found myself trying to navigate some kind of pathway of safety and really not knowing how. And I suppose it got to a point then where it was just easier to not kind of get too involved in arguments, to just kind of take a quieter approach than maybe I had previously. I think it's funny, the first barrier that I think to name in terms of coming to terms with what had been happening to me was myself, was recognising it for what it is. I think in naming myself as a barrier, I think actually I have to think a little bit more, a bit more broadly. And actually, if I wasn't recognizing what was happening to me as domestic abuse, then it was actually because there wasn't enough information or supports around me for me to know that it was that. I think it was at a time where really my conceptual, like how I conceptualized domestic abuse was purely through the physical. So if I was being berated, I didn't see that as abuse. If I was being frightened or intimidated, I didn't see that as abuse. If I was, nearly hit but not hit, it didn't count because it wasn't physical contact. And I suppose at some point something happens where you just can't anymore. It's no longer safe, or you've reached a breaking point. And for me, that was understanding that Magnus's actions were not just within the kind of emotional abuse category or the fear or the threat, but that they had been quite consistently for a long time within the kind of sexual violence framework. And it was incredibly scary to say that for the first time. I didn't use the words rape. I just couldn't. I didn't want to see myself as a victim. I couldn't bear to think about the reality of all of this. So I used very, language that was couched, that was hidden. So I remember telling a friend at the time that he had been having sex with me while I was asleep. And she immediately said, that's not sex, that's rape. And I knew it when she said it, but it was so hard to hear because language is really important, and I just wasn't ready to view it in those terms. I think what surprises me still about all of this is that there's still a lot of shame perhaps there on my part. And I think I didn't like being called brave when I first waived my anonymity a few years ago, because I didn't think that I was being brave. I thought I was just doing what the right thing to do was. But I suppose now I'm in a kind of a strange place where this is known about me. It's widely known. If someone Googles me, it's there. And I'm also trying to navigate a profession where we don't really tend to talk about our experiences. And before I began my training, I was warned that if I had spoken about this publicly, I wouldn't get into training and it would pose all sorts of difficulties for me professionally. And so now I find myself almost reconfronting that stigma and shame again, because although I believe in this very strongly, I'm also facing that kind of worry and concern about what will colleagues, what will managers think about me now that they know this about me. Will I be seen as less of a psychologist, less capable of doing my work because of what's happened to me? And obviously that shame or stigma isn't that strong, or I'm not buying into it enough that, it doesn't prevent me from speaking. But I think it's really important to name, and I think if I'm experiencing that, I can only imagine what it's like for others who are too frightened to talk about it, who maybe are still at the cusp of realising what their experiences are. And I actually think for those reasons it's really important that I continue to speak, not just publicly, but with colleagues of mine, and for us to talk about shame and stigma within our own circles. I really don't want to be known as a victim or a survivor, because it consistently ties me to an individual whose actions I didn't control. They weren't my actions, they were his, and I don't see why I should be defined by his. What feels really important for me now, at the kind of position that I'm in now as a psychologist in clinical training, is that I'm modelling hope and recovery for those that I work with, or perhaps those who will see this, or who have read or seen things that I've contributed to, and they can see that there is life beyond something really awful happening to you. So I suppose in looking at the annual report, just in the kind of general sense, I think perhaps the thing that struck me most was, well, there were two things: that the majority of the disclosures are being made through the helpline. And I think that's really important because it speaks to something around the safety of not being face to face with someone when talking about these things. And the second thing that really struck me was the huge amount, the majority of what women were talking about was emotional abuse. I think shame and stigma were highlighted all throughout the report, as both barriers and reasons why maybe perhaps people don't want to go too far with kind of discussing their experiences. And I think in terms of a wider society approach, we need to start actually confronting our own biases. I think we need to be open that some of us, most of us on some level, will have a sense of stigma or shame or prejudice about people who've experienced sexual violence and domestic abuse. And it's no use saying that we don't have them. So I suppose when I read this year's report, what touched to a lot of my own experiences was that sense, that kind of very wide spectrum in terms of experiences with the guards and also I suppose with the court system. First of all, I don't think it's good enough that there's a range of experience. I think the experience has to be consistent, and I don't think there's room for kind of a grey area on that. I acknowledge that it's incredibly difficult, particularly for the guards who are kind of in that kind of first line of response, to know what to say, perhaps to get it right all of the time. But I think they need to be supported appropriately. I think they need as much training as possible, and I suppose I don't know what training they get at the moment. Is that we're told that when something happens, if you experience a crime, come forward to the police, tell them. And if you're not getting a wholly supportive experience, it makes you wonder why you've bothered. Then you go through a court system that is absolutely traumatizing. It gaslights you, it questions whether it really happened, if you really remembered it that way. I don't think that should be allowed. So I think when the lockdown was initially announced, one of the first thoughts I had was, what about women in situations where there's live domestic abuse? The thought of being in a house where perhaps one's every move is already monitored and scrutinised just seemed terrifying to me. I suppose I thought about all this kind of small ways, and if we think about it, all of our lives have been impacted by lockdown. And if we think about all of the anger and anxiety and sadness and frustration that any of us who aren't in a domestic abuse situation have experienced as an almost norm, as a normal response to lockdown, and then to think about someone who was already terrified being in the home, who perhaps made as many kind of ways to be out of the home as possible, to suddenly be stuck in that home. I think that we need to see an increased response to how we support women who are in very vulnerable, very dangerous situations. We know that lives can get lost through this, and I don't think that should be the only thing that we focus on. We should be looking at the impact in terms of well-being, trauma, employment. Also thinking that we're within a housing crisis, and for a lot of women it potentially becomes a case of, well, either I stay in this house where there are four walls and a roof, or I have nowhere else to go. And I just don't think in 2020 that that's acceptable. I think our government do have to step up